All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Just first thing to kick off on our agenda, I wanted to talk about our financial projections. I know at a prior meeting, we discussed a little bit of kind of our prior funding and how that was organized. Let me switch the screen I'm sharing. So after some discussion and review, we've looked at the MoDOT funding that comes in both federal and state, and then all of our kind of sub-allocated and the local funds required to match that. And when you look at that statewide funding, the TIP numbers that we see or for our targets don't include engineering. But then when it gets to the actual programming amounts, there's engineering, there's carryover funds, there's other things that impact the amount that we get from year to year. We do not have really much information as far as MoDOT projections go beyond 2026 or 27. And so just kind of our thought was to combine all of it, first of all, and just call it MoDOT directed revenue. So that way we, we don't have to try to project each of those individual categories. We just know that, we kind of have an overall amount of funding that comes to our area. And then based on what we've been hearing over the last few years about more funding going towards asset management or even to other parts of the state, some major bridge repairs also coming off the top of the funding. Even though our STIP projections are a little bit higher over these next few years, just starting 2027 at $40 million for that MoDOT portion. And then growing that by about 1% a year. So MoDOT in their own projections, they foresee about 0.8% growth in fuel tax revenue, 1% in vehicle sales, 1% registration fees. And the way the funding kind of fluctuates over the years, we thought 1% would be appropriate. For the sub-allocated funds to the OTO, this is an estimate for 22 based on 21, but we've generally seen, give or take, about 2% growth in that funding. Sometimes there's changes in the obligation limitation that may kind of increase that or decrease it, but over the life of the FAST Act and then even just in prior years, it seems like 2% has been a fairly accurate estimate for growth. On the other hand, the TAP funding, and even with the FAST Act, it was kind of just set for the course of the bill. It did end up with some other changes to the obligation limitation that gave us a little bit more funding one year. And so really going forward, one thing we don't know on these two is what's going to happen in the next reauthorization. All accounts are that we will see an increase in funding. What percentage share of the STBG, the TAP will be, what will that do to our overall numbers? We're not really sure. So at this point, with that being an unknown, what I've done on the TAP is basically set it for 5 years, grow it by 2%, set it for 5 years, grow it by 2%. And then the local amount.
Natasha?
Yeah.
Could you kind of go over MoDOT's direct revenue there?
Sure.
And why it go, it's in 22 and 23 it goes up, and then 24 I guess goes down. Could you talk a little bit about why that huge fluctuation occurs?
Yeah, sure. Frank, do you want to kind of pitch in on how the funding goes from year to year in the STIP.
Yeah, why is 2025 much lower than 2023?
Yeah, I can do that. There's actually a little bit of a bump in funding because of some Amendment 3 bonds being reissued. But the bigger picture too is the fact that we take the major bridge program off the top. And so depending on the amount of major bridge work goes around the state, that translates to how much funding is distributed to the various districts by the formulas. And so the first thing that gets funded when we do have funds to distribute is the asset management funding, which is based on system size mostly. And so OTO gets a relatively small amount of that. But once we have funds beyond that amount, then that's based on population, jobs, and traffic. And then OTO gets a little bit bigger piece of that. So we do see a lot of fluctuation, but it's kind of a factor of how it normally operates, and then some special circumstances with the Amendment 3 happening in the next 5 years.
Okay, so these are incoming funds influenced by debt payments and distribution and other things. That's just not the income coming in.
Yeah, that's everything being allocated to this area based on the funding distribution formula that the commission has established. And Natasha, I don't know, did you factor in also some of the adjustments to like award adjustments and complete adjustments yet in these numbers?
A little bit on the 22 to 26. So these are the projections for the STIP. And I subtracted out what would be considered funds from other sources, since that would probably be reflected here. And so, you know, at the end of the day, these maybe aren't exactly what we'll have when we go to line everything out in the TIP, but it'll be pretty close to what we're actually programming. And so, Kirk, what we also see in 23, I think Frank kind of under programmed 22, and there's certain projects that have been moved to 23. And so we'll see some adjustments there. So these first, 5 years, we actually know what's getting programmed and what that income is. And we really lose all sense of, what those exact numbers will be beyond 27.
Okay, well, that answers my question. I appreciate that very much.
Yeah. And so for the local funding, that is just a simple formula as to what is required to match the projected amount of sub-allocated SDVG and TAP funding. And so at the end of the day, that gives us over $1.3 billion for through 2045. When compared to our last plan, I think we actually were about 1.4 on that one. So we're just a little bit under that, but really close actually in about how much money we have available over the life of this plan. And so couple additional unknowns, and we may revisit these numbers based on that, either before or after we adopt the plan. There is a sales tax, or a gas tax increase sitting in the House right now up at the state. And so we don't know yet if that's going to pass. And if that does, we should know by May. And then, I guess we'll see what the governor does in regards to signing that. But we don't necessarily want to count on that funding yet. So then we can have the discussion of what to do with that additional funding if and when that comes through. And then also, there's all sorts of infrastructure bills and the impending reauthorization all up at the federal level. And if anything, we anticipate that'll bring extra funding to the area, but it may also adjust some formulas and different things. And so we don't really know exactly what the impact of those will be. And so our thoughts are right now to go ahead and have this kind of a conservative estimate, get those priorities really locked in with our fiscally constrained list. And then from there, look at what we're able to do with the extra funding if and when that should come. So are there any other questions about the assumptions behind these numbers or any suggested adjustments? Frank, anything else you want to add about MoDOT's kind of outlook?
I just point out that this does not include any statewide cost share funding coming to the region. And I know in the past, OTO has kind of made an assumption about that. So I guess I'd leave that up to the group if you want to look at it again, but just want to make a point that it's not including that funding source.
Yeah, and I guess I will say this is kind of like our minimal or minimum anticipated amount of funding to the area. You know, in the last plan, we amended it to show the revenue from the build grant that Springfield received, and those kind of discretionary funds and cost share funds. You know, the process has worked a little differently over the last few years, and as far as guaranteeing what kind of or what amounts of funding those would be, we just don't have those included in these numbers. So unless the group would feel more comfortable having some sort of, you know, projected amount of extra funding that could come to the area, you know, I think we just maybe kind of deal with those funds as we get them. Okay, well, if there's no questions on those, I'm just going to propose that we, you know, kind of start with those numbers and use those to fiscally constrain our project list as we get all of those submitted and prioritized. And then, you know, if something happens like with this gas tax before we, you know, adopt the plan, we can always revisit that or, you know, make amendments in the future if the situation really changes. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about on the agenda are the prioritization factors. And we did briefly discuss these before. You know, we've looked at what other kind of information we have available to score projects. You know, we do get MoDOT really has added a lot of information, you know, to their different databases over the, you know, probably even since the last plan. But at the end of the day, at the same time, a lot of that information is still on state routes, and maybe don't get down to all of the you know, roadways that are important to our communities. So Dave and I really kind of looked at the prioritization glossary for the STIP process. And then based on the goals that we've set forth for this plan and knowing that, you know, this is kind of a first step to what is later the STIP prioritization process, added a few additional categories. And so I'm going to go over those changes real quick. And then, you know, if there's any other things or ways that you guys would all like to score, we'll definitely consider those. And then also consider what points or what weights. We don't have to stick with the points that are currently assigned through that STIP process. You know, all of that can definitely be adjusted as well. But at the same time, I know we spent a lot of time at least developing the criteria for the STIP prioritization. And so yeah, I kind of want to honor that process as well. So keeping the same, our high volume corridors. Currently that has 6 points possible. And so that's really kind of a replacement for what used to be our corridors of regional significance, but really just giving some attention to those corridors that do have a lot of traffic. And then safety, and I'll have Dave help explain this if anyone has questions, but it's really looking at a combination of accident rates, fatalities, and injuries, and then kind of normalizing that to a score. And then because the way the score works out, it gets kind of rescaled from 1 to 10. And then to account for the weight that's been given to this overall category, it's multiplied by 4 to achieve that 40 max possible points. Bicycle and pedestrian safety. So this is a proposed addition to this, and it's looking at kind of a 5-year range. And basically, if there's 1 to 3 bicycle and or pedestrian crashes at that location, it gets 5 points. 3 to 5 crashes, I'm suggesting 10 points. And then if there's, I guess, more than 5, just that, more than 5, you know, kind of giving it a much larger scale. Again, these points can be adjusted based on the weight that the group decides. This is just kind of a starting point. We looked at the bike ped crash map. MoDOT produces one, and at most locations, when you zoom in, this would create at least kind of a strata between different locations. And also, I think we would also, and we would do this for the plan purpose as well, we really, when it comes to scoring, would break projects into segments. 1 for affordability, 2 because we do need to split between kind of different years for the projects. And so I don't anticipate us having something where it's like Kansas from Norton to 60 and then, you know, getting all the points because there's so many crashes. We would look at the intersections or the segments and kind of do that in pieces. So then the next one is one that's already in there: improvement or removal of an at-grade railroad crossing. 5 points possible for that. Multimodal category for facilities that transfer between modes. And so we're looking at bike, ped, transit, and truck and rail. So it kind of covers both aspects of that. And so the points are based on each mode connected. The next one we are adjusting. So in the last plan, the environmental justice, we had tracks and we looked at a variety of factors, including there are required for environmental justice that we look at minorities and low income. But then we had also added in disability and elderly and I think it might have been youth. So there were up to 5 categories, and it was based on the census tract. And you know, those really, especially when you get out of Springfield, those can cover some very large areas. And so maybe not reflecting the concentration that there might be of certain categories. And so I know with the STIP prioritization process, we had taken that down to being just minorities and just low income. Dave has been working with this information, and we'll be able to put it into hex bins, which will be much, much smaller and more focused, and be able to kind of give us a more, I don't know if accurate's the right word, but you know, a better picture of where those populations are located rather than just saying this huge giant tract, you know, has a certain percentage. And so we proposed doing that and kind of using that as the geography instead. So getting much more focused look at the minority and low income populations. And then proposing that if rather than doubling the points for having both minority and low income, having a slightly smaller scale on that one so that we don't lose the impact of just, you know, even having the presence of a high percentage of minorities or a high percentage of low income. Dave, did I describe the hex bins appropriately.
Yeah, I think the hope is that by using the hex bins and census block groups to aggregate some of the low to moderate income populations and minorities, we can identify where those groups are in our outlying communities, because right now everything's just Springfield based on the OTO average. Everything kind of falls in, northwest Springfield. But by doing with the smaller geographies and hex bins, if there is a population that is in Ozark or Republic or something like that, we'll be able to identify that with those hex bins rather than just completely saying, there's nothing out there. If there is something out there, we'll be able to catch it.
Yeah, so hopefully that'll be able to apply better to our whole region. And then we've kept both the congestion management current and future the same, and that's based on volume to capacity ratios. And then this one's from our model, and so that's been updated for 2045. And I think Dave said he's already been using that for the STIP prioritization. Also keeping the same, the freight corridor on the statewide freight plan, the percentage of freight traffic in bridge condition. We did remove the travel time criterion because one that's been kind of hit and miss with COVID and everything else. And then really as far as like more having this long-term look at our projects, that's probably at least somewhat captured under this congestion management. So then the last two, and again, these are just proposed points. Happy to take any suggestions on any of that, but one for extending the life cycle. So I know there's a lot of discussion, especially as we add lanes and do some different things with our asset management, that we will be increasing the cost of the maintenance on our system. But at the same time, there are certain projects that incorporate certain updates that would delay maintenance. For example, if we did an intersection project and all of the signals got upgraded as part of that project, those are signals that really kind of their life cycle starts over. We don't have to replace the ones that would be there otherwise just as part of a maintenance project. And so we'll kind of have to be a little bit more careful in reviewing the description of each project and deciding when that applies. But I think it's at least important to note that some projects don't necessarily just add maintenance. They can I guess substitute for that routine maintenance. And then also local priority, and we've had this in the past. It's kind of a way for the community to say, this really is our most important, and give it some points to maybe make up for a lack of score otherwise, because you guys do know what your priorities are. But then also some projects just don't score well, whether it's because information doesn't exist or it's a new route that won't have that data on it. And so we're proposing that each community can choose 2 projects as local priorities to assign that 10 points to. And so we'll kind of come back after everyone submitted all of their projects and get that information from you. So are there any questions about any of the criteria?
I have a question about the environmental justice. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is going to sound really weird, but is that going to be positive or negative points if you have something coming through a community? I can see where a sidewalk would definitely be a positive, but if you're expanding something through a community, would that be considered positive or negative?
Well, and so that has been the, I guess, constant discussion that we even have internally. I think generally speaking that we are not in the habit of, building freeways through existing communities like in the past. Like for what environmental justice is supposed to address. And so the majority of our projects tend to improve travel time, provide those additional accommodations. And you know, and when we improve travel time, that also improves transit travel time. And so at this point, we, I guess, view those improvements as being positive. And if a specific project really is going to have a negative impact, then that needs to be reviewed even when that project, I guess, is going forward before it actually gets programmed in the TIPRS tip.
And maybe something to consider with transportation improvements is it's not like, you know, we're putting a coal-fired power plant in a, you know, low-income area because they don't have, you know, the voice to put up resistance to that, you know. And theoretically, all these transportation improvements should be a benefit to connectivity for groups. If it were something more detrimental, maybe that would be negative points. But as you know, we're looking at this kind of generally, you know, these should be benefits for everybody.
So I'll also add that some of the guidance we're seeing start to come out at the federal level is directing funding to be spent in environmental justice areas. You know, really looking at the impact of projects and that we're not neglecting to spend dollars in those areas. And so having a score that gives points for that, I think would be in line with what their guidance is as well.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. I assumed that was what we were aiming for, but I just knew that in the past, that's usually been something that had a negative connotation as far as that's what we were trying to mitigate a negative connotation. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Are there any other questions about either the existing or the proposed?
You know,
categories?
Tasha, this is Frank. On
Yeah.
the local preference, I mean, I like the idea of being able to have the local agencies kind of tell us through the process what's important. But as I think about it, you know, if I assume that everybody's going to be very parochial about it and just prioritize the projects in their area, it seems like that's a lot for Springfield to have to go through. And if you're like Battlefield, it's going to be FF, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how we kind of reconcile that, but that's just kind of one issue I see with it.
As far as having two projects that they can assign to that.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of, I look at the bigger corridors that we're trying to work on. Those are kind of all technically within Springfield. I guess we have one in Ozark too, but yeah, I'm sure they're going to want to focus on more of the local types of priorities. And so, and they're just going to have a longer list. They're doing more with the regional traffic, whereas some of the other smaller communities are probably doing only with the local traffic.
So Don or Kirk, do you have any thoughts on that? I guess we lost Don. Kirk, do you have any thoughts on what it might take, or you're muted? So I guess part of my thought process on that too, Frank, was that, you know, for Springfield even, they probably wouldn't need to assign those extra points to something like, you know, a 60 or I-44 project, because it would probably already meet a lot of the other criteria. And so then they would be able to still apply those points, and maybe on a smaller project that wouldn't score as well. And like always, at the end of the day, we have the ability to, as a group, vote and decide if something, should stay on or fall off a list.
So as we go through this, the goal is to have a fiscally constrained list. It's not necessarily going to be in order, right?
Correct.
So the only advantage of these points would be it would move it from into the financially constrained list. And so it wouldn't move it ahead of like I-44. It would just make sure that whatever the top priority was got on the fiscally constrained 20-year list.
Correct.
Yeah, and I think Natasha's right. A lot of those needs in Springfield will do well with other criteria. And as I think about it a little bit more, the counties may have a moderating effect because they're going to probably look county-wide, and you may have the county and a city doubling up on a priority potentially.
Yeah, and I guess, yeah, that is possible. So, so based on just kind of the initial thoughts through this process, so bike ped safety, I had proposed a max of 20 points, environmental justice a max of 8. Extending the life cycle was 3, and local priority was 10. Real quick, let me just do the math on what all of that adds up to. So that would be a max of 123 points. I don't really, think it's important one way or the other to have this round up to an even 100 or anything. But if we did want to do that, we definitely could. Does anyone have thoughts of kind of how these different categories end up weighting compared to others?
Now, are we, I'm sorry, I've been distracted, but
Sure.
Are we getting opinions or recommendations on how these points are assigned?
Yes.
Because bike ped seems kind of high to me.
Yeah, and the initial thought was that there probably wouldn't be too many that would actually score that max. And so it would really just capture those high locations, and otherwise it's 5 or 10. But again, I'm open to, any suggestions on that.
Okay, I'm glad you went to that though. It is based on bike ped crashes though.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, well that's good.
Yeah, again, it's not normal, if it's vehicular to vehicular crash, then yeah, that wouldn't count.
Okay. That makes a difference. I think I understand better now.
Okay. And so really, in order to, I guess the max would generally be 5 or 10 depending on the number of crashes, but it would really have to be, a problem location to get the full 20.
Yeah, that's significant. All right, when are we gonna vote on this?
Well, we can take suggestions today. I can also, I'd like to email it out because there are people not on this call.
Yeah.
And so, I just really wanted to be able to go over it all and go ahead and take any suggestions before we do send it out to the broader group. If there are changes you'd like to make now.
Do you have I probably didn't do my homework. Do we have a ratings example out there for our different choices?
We do not, based on the changes that have been made.
Okay.
But we could try and put something together.
All right, we'll take a look at this and see. I don't know that we have an opinion today.
Okay.
I'm glad you have something to throw on the table though for us to evaluate.
Yeah, I always find sometimes it's easier to make changes than think up something. So
Yeah, no, that's good. I think that's great that you were able to come to these recommendations.
Tasha, can we look at safety again? 'Cause I'm
Sure.
noticing how it's basically a third of the score.
Frank,
Yeah.
we can hardly hear you. Can you like talk right into your mic or something?
Yeah.
yeah, so Frank was asking about safety and being, a huge portion of that score, and that is something that came out of that STIP prioritization process. So Dave, do you want to kind of speak to that?
Well, I was hoping we wouldn't have to.
Okay.
But, this is kind of the taking into account the number of the actual crash rate and then fatalities and injury crashes. So it's just basically that this is mostly MoDOT data. So if we get something that's not on the state of the system segments, it may be more difficult to compile this information. But this is all existing attributes in those fields. So it's just kind of a way to get this information from Jeff City and then put it together in kind of a multi-criteria evaluation to combine the actual crash rate, giving them equal importance. So this is the same thing that we have been doing for the past few years in the STIP priority. So it's just, how MoDOT calculates the crash rates for intersections and segments, I should add. And then, they're all these different categories are combined into 4 different groups. And then that ranking 1 through 4 is additive, and then it all comes together. So this is the same thing that we have been doing. The difference was last year, we put that multiplier in there that multiplies the rescaled score by 4 to give it a lot more weight. I don't think there's going to be anything out there that gets 40. There might be a 36 or a 32, but there was nothing that really scores 4 in all the different categories for the actual rate by type. And if there is, then MoDOT should already have that on their radar, because obviously that's, huge problem. And this is based on the entire Southwest District. So it is trying to communicate with you guys that, this is actually a safety concern for us here, but it's a safety concern within the district too, because we know that you've got a larger area to work with and everything like that. So it's just trying to be consistent. But then how it got multiplied by that multiplier score really kind of inflated all this. So I think everything's going to come in pretty much between, maybe 16 to 32 or something like that in there. But that's where we get most of our points, because in, our performance measures and everything, we're looking at safety really hard. So that's why it's so high. But if you have any suggestions, we're wide open to that. But this is just based on MoDOT's information for roadways in the Southwest District.
Based on where we're at with funding, that's probably a good place to be. Sarah, you're on this call. Is OTO gonna send a letter to all of our representatives suggesting that they vote for the gas tax increase?
Yes, we did that over spring break, and I did have at least one call me and tell me that they received it and ask questions. So yes, I do know that they received those.
All right. I just think we need to push for that. I don't have any other questions.
Dave, thanks for going over the safety information again. I just wanted to talk about that a little bit more since it was so significant in the prioritization process. And I guess the assumption we're all making is that our projects will somehow improve safety or address the problems that are showing up in the segments that we're talking about. But just so everybody knows, we do get some dedicated safety funds, and we are developing a safety plan. In fact, we're starting to get some preliminary results right now, which is based on looking at a cost benefit of a presumed safety solution like high friction surface treatment or roundabouts for specific safety problems. So this is not the only avenue for addressing safety. We will have dedicated funding for safety.
And this looks a lot more complex than it actually is. You know, just counting up the stuff, that's simple. It's just putting it on paper with the numbers and the formulas. It just looks a lot more complicated than what we're actually doing.
So I think we are definitely open to, you know, exploring the weights for these different factors. So we can, you know, kind of have that discussion with what I email out, and we'll take proposals on, you know, how we should rate all of that. And then, you know, I'd like to kind of firm that all up before our next meeting. And then that way we can see how everyone should hopefully have had their projects submitted by then. I'm asking for them all to be submitted by the 15th. And so hopefully, you know, we're going to start going through them, you know, kind of as they come in, so Dave can get them mapped and start getting some data tied to them. You know, and if we make some adjustments, we can fix it along the way, but hopefully it won't be quite the tall order, you know, on April 16th for Dave to process all of them at once. So I definitely, you know, would, you know, appreciate and like your feedback on this, and you know, definitely if you have any questions, just let me know.
I think it's like a lot of things. We'll just have to see how it goes and see
Yeah.
if we can break it. Then we'll know that we need to fix something.
Yeah. And if we break it, we can either fix it, or we can just say, hey, you know, this project's important enough, regardless of its score, you know, we just vote it to the fiscally constrained list. You know, and sometimes that's just what we have to do. Okay. Well, I will share that out and kind of give everyone a chance to provide feedback, both on the criteria and on the weighting of the various points. So then I also just wanted to ask, for those who have started entering in their projects, any questions or any problems, or just any thoughts on that process? I know I've seen some projects from Republic entered in. I don't know that I've seen much from everybody else, but I'm guessing, you know, you guys are all still kind of working on your lists for what to actually enter.
I don't think we have any questions.
Okay. Yeah, and just let me know if you do run into any, you know, issues along the way, and you know, and if there's something we can do to help you all get them entered in by the 15th, you know, just let us know.
Okay. Thank you, MoDOT, for Adopt a Highway folks being mobilized, making a big difference.
Frank, did you guys count how many masks got cleaned up with this highway cleanup?
Yeah, I don't know, maybe Beth knows, but we're basically gonna mobilize everybody at some point.
Yeah, we pretty much have put out kind of a MoDOT challenge to all employees, and guidance is coming out on that for everybody to get out and have the opportunity to help pick up the trash as well. So
Yeah, we're mobilizing city volunteers in April.
So yep, that's what we'll be keeping track of, all the bags picked up, and when it's all said and done, they'll I'm sure come out with a kind of a release of what they do for this for the month of April, how many bags we picked up and what kind of cost savings and all of that.
Well, hopefully people just stop throwing trash out the windows.
That too, yeah.
Is that what causes litter? There seems to be a total disconnect there. So,
See, I think it all just blows out of the back of a truck. I don't know.
well, there could be a lot of that too. I found out, unfortunately, in reading through some of our guidance that unsecured loads are like a $25 fine, and that's it.
Oh,
Where if you actually intentionally littered, they could fine you up to $1,000. But if you just don't bother to strap it down in the back of your truck, then that's just $25.
I didn't even know there was a fine for that. So
Yeah, but unfortunately, I've run into this before because there can be some very serious safety issues with unsecured loads, and we've got no teeth. So.
okay. Well, if there is not anything else, I appreciate everyone being here today. And our next meeting is April 22nd. And so everyone should have all of their projects submitted by then. And we'll have a feel, hopefully, for where we want our prioritization process to be.
Okay,
All right. Well, thanks, everyone.
good job. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.